everyone. Welcome to the Newberry Library. Thanks for coming out, especially during our renovation, right? We'll look much more beautiful this summer when our renovation will be over, right? Our whole first floor renovation. And we'll also have lots of new and beautiful spaces, gathering spaces, spaces to view collection materials, classroom spaces. It should be really exciting. I'm Liesl Olson. I'm Director of Chicago Studies here at the Newberry. And it is my great pleasure to introduce to you tonight Essence McDowell, who is one of the co-authors of this amazing new book, this guide, Lifting as They Climbed, Mapping a History of Black Women on Chicago's South Side, which I heard about on the radio a while back. I heard Essence and her co-author talking on WBEZ, and I got very, very excited. This book is jam-packed with information, but it's also light enough for you to carry around with you as you walk through the neighborhoods of Chicago's South Side, learning about the incredible history and culture of this city as it was produced, made, created, envisioned by African-American women. The book helps us to geographically place and understand many women in Chicago, some of whom are very famous, like poet Gwendolyn Brooks and singer Mahalia Jackson, educator and artist and activist Margaret Burroughs, who of course founded the DuSable Museum of African American History, playwright Lorraine Hansberry, most famous for A Raisin in the Sun. And the book is also filled with information about some figures who are lesser known, but as fascinating. Figures like Vivian G. Harsh, the first African-American librarian in the Chicago Public Library System, who oversaw the George Cleveland Hall Branch Library, of course still operating as a Chicago Public Library. Her colleague, Charlamagne Rollins, who was the children's librarian at Hall Branch and an incredible educator, and many, 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 many others. The guidebook helps us to see how these women were connected together, how they were part of a social and cultural and political fabric in Chicago that produced some of the most powerful expressions of American culture. There are so many directions that this guidebook can take you, and Essence and her co-author, Mariam Kaba, say this in the introduction, that in some ways the book is just a beginning of our understanding of the richness and depth of what women on the South Side of Chicago did for their community, their city, and their country. So I know that Essence and her co-author did a great deal of work at libraries all over Chicago and elsewhere, including at the Harsh Collection at 95th and Halsted. And it's worth mentioning that there are many collections here at the Newberry that are relevant to the histories contained in this guidebook. Our dance collections, for instance, are where you can find out more about Katherine Dunham, the amazing dancer and choreographer who really combined the balletic traditions and vernacular cultures in her really incredible choreography, and who, of course, got her start right here in Chicago. You might also check out at the Newberry our holdings of real estate records and our maps that illuminate the redlining and restricting housing covenants that defined the shape of the city for so long. You can also come browse back issues of the Chicago Defender, or look at images of the now demolished Savoy and Regal ballrooms that were along the Stroll in Bronzeville, images that are now contained in our Kurt Teich Postcard Archives collection. So there's a great deal here at the Newberry that really complements the work of this book. And there's a sheet too on our side table that gives you a few other places you can go here at the Newberry, a few other collections that you might explore that are related to the kind of work that this book does. So now let me tell you a little bit more about Essence McDowell. She started out her career as a journalist, writing for national newspapers like the Daytona Beach News Journal and the Afro-American in Washington, D.C. As print media transitioned into the digital sphere, Essence began writing for online platforms and then came to Chicago to obtain her master's degree in journalism and new media from DePaul University. She expanded into digital communications by taking on consulting projects for state and local organizations. She designed Cafe Society, a digital toolkit for the Illinois Humanities Council to help connect local communities through conversations related to social justice. She also designed a website for the Illinois Capital Forum, a program that brings students together to engage in project-based learning within the humanities. In 2013, Essence began working with the Social Justice Initiative at the University of Illinois in Chicago as the media coordinator and digital activist for the Freedom Dreams, Freedom Now conference. Since then, she has worked as communications coordinator for the Chicago Torture Justice Memorials, national media coordinator for Insight's Color of Violence 4 conference, and community engagement manager with Chicago Gallery 400. Essence McDowell is now a member of Love and Protect, an organization that provides support for women and gender nonconforming individuals who have been criminalized by the state for defending themselves against intimate partner violence. Her current focus is Bridging While Black, a citywide Black student collective connecting activists, justice-centered organizations, and Chicago communities. She is also on the board of the Chicago Freedom School, and she works as the digital media strategist and program manager at the Social Justice Initiative. Please give a warm welcome to Essence McDowell.
I am so honored to be here today. I'm so grateful you guys came out today. Finally, the sun came out and we're here. So I'm excited about this. This project has been the most incredible experience of my entire life. To be able to tell these stories about these 48 Black women who really developed Chicago in a lot of different areas, to be able to tell their stories and make sure that their lives are remembered and that their stories are heard is just such an honor to me. So I just want to say thank you for that. I tried to narrow it down. You know, there's 48 and I only have about 40 minutes or so I couldn't talk about all of them, but I did select a couple that I feel like really signify the breadth of the book and the tour and what it is that we're trying to really bring to readers by telling the stories of these women's lives. Today is really special, I think, in this moment. We had a powerful videographer do a commercial for the book so that we can continue to spread the word, especially in this very digital era, and make sure that people just know what it is and know that it's out here and know that it's available. So there's a preview today. We haven't released the film. It's a short commercial. We haven't released it yet, and today you'll get a first look. And I just want to kind of introduce the whole entire talk with the film so you understand more about the book. Lifting as They Climb is a guidebook that features the stories of 48 Black women through 33 sites and locations throughout the South Side of Chicago. Their stories are largely missing from mainstream narratives, although they contributed so substantially to the social, political, and cultural landscape of Chicago.
I am a lover of all things Black history and definitely Black women, so I was really excited to participate on this tour.
It's really accessible for people to just go to these different sites that are outlined in this book.
We should know about their lives and the legacies that they left behind because it's a blueprint for how we can move forward and solve a lot of the issues of today.
I learned about a lot of people today that I had no idea that they existed and what they brought to this country, to the city, to the state.
Because many of them often don't have landmarks, you can't necessarily tell that some of the most influential Black women in Chicago's history lived at these locations. For instance, Mahalia Jackson, who was the queen of gospel, also a civil rights activist, lived right here at the Scholars Corner.
There was a theme of them having to do things by themselves, drawing upon their own resources, drawing upon the community, but everybody was all about giving back. And it was something that I found particularly inspiring.
So many of these people are unsung heroes, and just, you know, not even heroes, regular everyday women who were just empowering people in their neighborhoods and communities.
We hope that folks are able to take the guidebook and insert themselves into these missing narratives, to get to know these women, the complex stories of their lives, and the strong legacies that they left behind.
What that means to me as a Black woman is being able to see myself in that history, to understand and draw from the strength of the contributions of the women that came before me. It's something that all Chicagoans should know about.
I'm standing in front of the former home of Marjorie Stewart Joyner. She worked with Madam C.J. Walker to expand the Walker Company, which provided thousands of Black women with the opportunity to own their own business. Marjorie also worked with Robert Abbott, the founder of the Chicago Defender, to organize the first Bud Billiken Parade.
I plan on using it to teach my nieces and to young Black girls around me to know that we've been here, we've been doing this, we're not new to this, we're true to this.
Not only do we need to honor the contributions of Black women, we need to make sure we preserve them for the future. So I'm really excited about this. I'm really excited about the work moving forward.
Now I'm on a mission to see the rest of these stops in the book.
I'd recommend this tour to anyone.
So I would highly recommend the tour and definitely the books.
You can become inspired by the solutions that Black women have made and the contributions that they have provided to the city and to our communities that we can take from the past and infuse into our future. Thank you so much. The video is just I feel like a snippet of all that we hope to communicate throughout the text. So when I think about like what is Lifting as They Climbed, it is such a small book. A lot of people go like, oh, this is it? And I'm like, yes, that's it. But it's really powerful in a small, compact size. It's an abridged history text on Black women's contributions, local, national, and international levels. It's a guided tour, so it takes you through 33 sites, landmarks, and locations to tell you the story of these Black women's lives, while also highlighting lesser-known geographical histories, specifically on the South Side. It's also mapping Black history as it relates to arts, the political sphere, and community organizing, and movement building throughout the city. So it's, to me, just such an extremely important project, really because the educational system in its current structure really serves as a catalyst to the erasure of Black history. This one-sided coin by which ultimately American history is taught to the masses often ignores, excludes, and negates vital African-American contributions, ingenious innovations, and socio-political developments that enhance this country. In particular, Black women's legacies have been disseminated as a footnote in this marginalized sphere of historical memory. The guidebook serves as a text that seeks to circumvent the mainstream narratives and insert a rich and vibrant telling of this nation's past through the lens of Chicago. So the book basically spans throughout the mid to early 19th century into the 20th century. The 48 women that we included are just a mere sample of the research that we found. Because we wanted to make this into a tour that was accessible to community members, it couldn't be the 50, 60, 70 to 100 women that we really desired to include. So we're trying to think about how to expand the project and also thinking about like when, because we do want to make sure that we uplift the stories that are yet to be told. Again, we wanted this project to be accessible so readers could carry it with them while they're going from site to site on these journeys throughout the communities. And their stories are shortened very intentionally. We hope that it encourages readers to research further, that it sparks their curiosity, that they take it on themselves to share it with their community members, that they are also sparked by the pride that you feel when you're walking to each of these sites and locations and understanding the history that pretty much created them. So I put together a little slideshow, very visual. I'm a very visual person. I basically designed the guidebook as a way to make sure that we are not talking about history in a way that leaves young people behind. We want them to engage and insert their own voices and understand the impact that so many lives have had on their today. So I'm gonna start here. This is Emma Jane Atkinson. If we consider the guidebook part of a really large story, it's pretty much a story of Chicago, and it really helps me, because I'm from New Jersey, to have a grounded understanding of what took place over the decades in Chicago's history. The story would begin with Emma Atkinson. She arrived in Chicago in 1847. During the time that she arrives, it's only about 200 people here, 200 black people, excuse me, in Chicago at that time. She comes with her husband, Isaac Atkinson, and they're said to be the 13th black family in Chicago. She was a part of this very secret Big Four group. They were abolitionist women who provided provisions for runaway slaves, so they basically gave food and shelter and clothing to the folks who were trying to gain their freedom in the northern states. And they were the original social service providers. They were abolitionists. And the reason why the Big Four is a secret is because we don't know the names, or we don't know much about the other three women at all. And also, as in abolitionist histories, we're not told the details. They wanted to keep their endeavors very secret so that they can continue to sustain these black lives that they were seeking to protect. So we chronicle many of these stories throughout the guidebook, and the Great Migration just happens to be the starting point. Here we have Union Station, circa 1930s. This is the colored waiting room. And I really love this picture because of all the beautiful people included in it. But it gives you a visual understanding of how many people were coming into the city during this time. The text expands from the Great Migration to the Great Depression. It covers Jim Crow. It goes into the Civil Rights era. And each of the women's stories gives us a snapshot of the social and political current running through the city at the different times. Between 1950 and 1970, there were nearly 7 million African Americans that left their homes in the South and came to the northern states. In Chicago, the Chicago experience with this Great Migration is really important, and it helps you understand how exactly black communities were shaped today and who were the individuals that were providing for these communities. So when they got here, a question I had was okay, so what did they come up against? To tell that story, I'd like to talk about Ada Sophia Dennison McKinley. How many have you heard of her? How many have heard of her social services? So she's a powerful, powerful, powerful woman because first she's a school teacher. She's a social reformer, and when she came to Chicago, she really saw the need to assist through World War I that was happening at the time. She served as a host to the World War Club and that was organized by the Chicago Urban League, and they provided services for soldiers and sailors who were returning from the war. She noticed that there were very limited social provisions provided for these soldiers that were returning, especially the African American soldiers. So she decided in 1919 to found the Soldiers and Sailors Club. So after her work, during and after, basically the World War I takes place, and then this is also trailing into the time where the Great Migration starts to kick off. So it wasn't just soldiers that were coming into Chicago, it started to be these African-American communities and families that I was discussing. These displaced families came seeking a better life, but they were definitely met with an economic disparity. They were coming into a city that would not and did not provide any accommodations to sustain their new citizens. So instead of, feeling overwhelmed by the conditions of her people, she decided to start her own Settlement House. All right, there it goes. So the Southside Settlement House is basically what she turns the Soldiers and Sailors Club into. She expands it so that it can accommodate the families that were coming into the city by providing shelter, employment opportunities, food, all different types of services for displaced migrants. The settlement house, Ada really made sure that it was like a breadth of programming that was happening. She wasn't just building an institution, she was sustaining it and making sure that it reached the communities that needed it the most. She had outreach programs for mothers, for infants, and especially around healthcare. The communities on the South Side didn't have access to the hospitals and clinics that were predominantly whites only. So she had to make up this lack in the gap by using the settlement house for these types of opportunities. She also had space for African-American artists, organizations held their meetings there. There were even 2 periodicals held in the space. So it was an all-encompassing space where she made sure that she didn't forget a particular demographic. Pictured here is the Southside Settlement House landmark. It's a part of the IIT campus. So when we were creating the guidebook, it was so interesting because it was almost like doing like a treasure hunt, and we were exploring. So many of the women that we could not include had no landmarks whatsoever. They were destroyed, they were not there, they were empty lots. And that really causes us to question how are we preserving history and how also we are intentionally destroying it, because these landmarks should exist. This Southside Settlement House, for her to have done all of this for the community, should still stand. There's a marker, which I encourage you all to try to find. It's a little bit, it's confusing because the campus is so immense, so this one marker stands there. But we wanted to make sure to include it because history is not just, you know, the once was, it's what's still there. And to stand there and see just this marker, that's a history lesson for me. That was understanding like what she built is not here, but I still have to understand the impact that she had. And we want readers to also grasp that through other locations in the guidebook as well. So McKinley's directorship of the settlement house really spanned throughout the community. She was very particular in making sure that she provided support for the public housing residents. One of the homes that she provided for was the Ida B. Wells homes. This is a landmark that we include in the text to tell the story of Leonida McLean. She's a woman who was a journalist that worked for the Chicago Tribune and rose to the heights of their ranks in her position very quickly right out of high school. She covered Mayor Harold Washington's campaign. She was just a phenomenal journalist, and she ended up committing suicide really early on in life. But her story is amongst those lesser known histories around Black women. And so as I go through these particular women, you'll see how lives intersect. So Ada was providing services for the Ida B. housing projects, which in some ways touched the life of Leonida McLean. So there's a lot of overlap. It's just like a beautiful onion of sorts where I'm constantly peeling the layers to understand Black women's history on a deeper level. Ada S. McKinley also worked with Jane Addams and other women who built settlement houses and were engaged in community activism. She became a prominent member in political spheres. She was a part of the Women's Club movement. She was also a leading member of the Phyllis Wheatley Club. She was the president of the Citizens Community Center, an organizer for the League of Women Voters in Chicago, and also the Chicago Commission on Race Relations. So for this woman to have done this much, I think that it signifies that she deserves to be in history books, and this is why we included her in the guidebook. To this day, the Ada S. McKinley Social Services still stands. It's reaching its 100th year anniversary, and the McKinley Centers are basically the largest human services organizations in the nation. And they provide for thousands of people and have about 600 employees. So you can see that there's a continued legacy here that makes her a phenomenal woman that we include in the book. Next, I'd like to talk about Alice Browning. Can I get a show of hands? How many people know about Alice? Oh, okay. Well, this makes it even more. I really love the fact that this is just a learning experience. And for me as well, when Miriam brought the project to my attention, I had no idea about many of these women. I'm not particularly a scholar around history. My background is definitely grounded in communications and digital media and how we can tell our stories. However, I didn't know about a lot of these women, especially the earlier abolitionists. So this was why I felt it was so necessary to create this guidebook and also be a part of this project in such an intentional way. So Alice Browning, she was born in Providence Hospital. Providence Hospital is another location that we include in the guidebook. And she came to take care of her and her family. She came when she was young, very young in age. She took courses at Chicago Norman College before earning a degree from the University of Chicago in 1931. It was at the University of Chicago that she met her husband, Charles Patrick Browning, and they married in 1936. Her husband actually would spend the rest of his career at the Chicago Defender, another location that we include in the guidebook, which is also a really powerful component of Chicago history that led to the Great Migration, that really helped a lot of Southern African Americans understand the opportunities that awaited them here in Chicago and other northern states. So Alice, in 1925, she experiences a series of tragedies that I think would really disable anyone. Her mother took her life. Shortly after, her father died in an unexpected way, and then her husband dies in a really tragic accident where he had a propeller hit him in the head. So it was really rough, but 5 years later, in 1930, she was acquiring her Illinois teaching certificate and decided to teach at Forest Elementary School and become a part of the Chicago public school system as an educator. And in 1941, she took a sabbatical year to get her MA from Columbia University. Browning also took courses at Northwestern and the Social Services Administration at the University of Chicago. And that was just the earlier part of her life, which I find so incredible. She recalls at the age of 7 that she had this passion for writing. And so when she was at Columbia getting her MA, she started to write short stories. So while she was writing and really trying to get her start in the creative writing field, she submitted an article to Esquire magazine that was rejected. She had better success at the Pittsburgh Courier with a story that was called New Year's Eve, but when she was rejected from the Esquire and other publications, this really inspired her to figure out how it was that she can help other Black women, other African American artists and writers get published in various outlets. So she borrowed $200 from her husband, Charles, and started the Negro Story. She started the Negro Story right in her home, which I find so powerful. This is 4019 Vincennes Avenue. And so in the first issue of the Negro Story, she published Richard Wright's story, Almost a Man. And the Negro Story ran from 1944 to 1946, publishing a total of 9 issues featuring prominent African American writers of the time like Ralph Elliston, Chester Himes, Langston Hughes, Margaret Burroughs, Richard Wright, Gwendolyn Brooks. So she had a really powerful impact on the writing community and also just literature as a whole. How do we not know her name? How is that possible? Browning also published one of her stories in every issue, and she published under the pseudonym Richard Bentley, which I believe is her way of making sure that people aren't, judging her writing, but also as a woman writer, you often don't get as much attention as male writers. So this is the way she navigated that. She also began to pursue more ambitious issues while she was doing the Negro Story Press. She became the editor of the Black Writers News publication, and in 1953, Browning launched a publication endeavor called the Browning Letter. I found a cover of it, and I thought that was just like, oh, this still exists, you know, the archives, you know. The Browning letter was, I believe, her way of just kind of creating something more entertaining. It was a lot of feature articles, society columns, you know, special interest stories. And so it basically went up until she decided to retire from the Negro Story, and the Negro Story Press decided to close. I would like you to keep in mind that throughout this entire timeline, in all of these endeavors that she took on, she was still teaching in Chicago public school systems. So she was an educator as well as a writer, as well as a publisher. In 1970, she retired from teaching and decided to gather fellow leaders in the African American community to plan the first International Black Writers Conference. Over the next decade, the conference would grow into a 3-day affair that was attended by writers like Oscar Brown Jr., Gwendolyn Brooks, Sam Greenlee, Alex Haley, Hakeem Mahabudi, and Margaret Walker, and plenty of others. In the image, you can see she's sitting here next to Sam Greenlee. If you're not familiar with Sam Greenlee, he wrote The Spook Who Sat by the Door, which is an incredible text that had me feeling very empowered at a certain point in life, but he's also a writer from Chicago, a powerful individual. I actually had a chance to speak with Sam Greenlee while he was still alive. So these connections that you can see throughout the book, that you find once you do a little more research about these women, really give you a broad understanding of what Chicago history looks like, especially from the lens of the arts. So I encourage you to learn a little more about Alice Browning if you have the chance. Next up is Addie Wyatt. Can I have a little poll? How many of you are familiar with Addie Wyatt? More, okay, that's better. So Addie Wyatt was born in Mississippi in 1924, and she came to Chicago in 1930 when she was just 6 years old. She was married to Claude S. Wyatt at the age of 16 and applied for jobs as a typist from the Armour Company. African-American women at the time were not hired as typists, so she had to be sent to the canning department. In 1953, Wyatt became the first Black woman elected into office in the Local 56 of the United Packing Workers of America. She was an ordained minister. She and her husband founded the Vernon Church of God in Chicago in 1955, and they began work with Martin Luther King Jr. They participated in major civil rights marches, including the March on Washington and the March from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama. Addie was also a leader in the struggle for the Equal Rights Amendment. Eleanor Roosevelt appointed Addie to the United States Commission on the Status of Women in the early 1960s. And then she became a founding member of the National Organization for Women. I'm gonna take a pause here, because sometimes their resumes are so extensive that I'm just like, a part of my admiration for these women come from the space of, like, in one lifetime, you can accomplish so much, and not just on an individual level. So many of these women were like institution builders, they were creators, but they were also heavily involved in organizations throughout Chicago, multiple organizations. In the guidebook, you'll see that we include additional affiliations. So you can see that most of the 48 women have about like 3 to 5, some even 10 organizations associated with their name that they founded, that they worked with. It was just a way of showing that communities were connected, and there were a lot of organizations that took form in order to support the communities that were being, created in Chicago during the different times throughout history. So a little more about Addie. She went on to become a founding member of the Coalition for Black Trade Unionists in 1972. And then she went on to found the Coalition for Labor Union for Women specifically. She gave a speech in front of 3,200 women. She was quoted as saying, "Racism and sexism is an economic issue. It was very profitable, it is very profitable, to discriminate against women and against people of color. I began to understand that change could come to you, but you could not do it alone. You had to unite others. That was one of the reasons I became a part of a union. It was a family that would help in the struggle." Also very interesting about Addie is that she was, in 1975, along with the politician Barbara Jordan, one of the first African-American women to be named by Time magazine as Person of the Year. That's her picture looking fly in the corner. Wyatt was the national vice president of the National Council of Negro Women and the recipient of many, many awards around her contributions to organized labor movements. She is one of the women in our book that really go kind of tiptoe into, you know, the 21st century. She counseled Barack Obama when he was a young organizer in Chicago and passed away in 2012. So Addie's really, really incredible. One of the things that I like to uplift as well is that, so for each woman, there's a site. Not each of them. Some of them we pair because they have connections to a particular institution or location. So the guidebook kind of will take you through their stories by location, but Addie's is the DuSable High School. I went past the DuSable High School, had no idea how rich in history it also was. The DuSable High School, for those who don't know, is 4934 South Wabash Avenue. It's a community cornerstone and educational institution that influenced generations of African Americans who journeyed from the South from the Great Migration in the years that followed. This prominent 3-story brick building is located in the Grand Boulevard community and was built to alleviate the severely overcrowded conditions of Wendell Phillips High School. Wendell Phillips High School is also one that we include in the book. I had the opportunity to go there when I was talking about Maudell Booseville, who is an educator that we include in the text. And through their halls, they have like a Hall of Fame. And you would be so surprised to know how many powerful and important people graduated from this school. And DuSable's is very similar in that way. It was basically, I think Nat King Cole graduated from there. A lot of jazz artists graduated from DuSable's. And so at a time when there was a rapidly growing community, they were predominantly confined to the South Sides, and they had to not only accommodate with housing, health, support services, but also through education. So, 33 sites and endless neighborhoods. You technically wouldn't be able, well, you could if you were ambitious. It took me, I think when I tried to do all of the sites in one day, it was about maybe like 7 hours, maybe. And that was like, you know, I got out, I read a little, touched the buildings. I would recommend that people really engage the guidebook as an activity that they could just manipulate in whatever way that they feel interested or comfortable. They can take the guidebook and go on an artist tour. They can take the guidebook and go on a labor tour. Whatever like special interest that you have, I believe that the guidebook can pretty much cover many of those. The communities that the guidebook spans from is, you know, it starts in the South Loop and ends all the way in Lower Woodlawn. Bronzeville is included, Kenwood, Douglas, Hyde Park. Many of these neighborhoods, what you'll see if you map out each of the points in the tour is that it's along this particular line, which is the Chicago Black Belt. When communities were becoming more filled and more populated because of the Great Migration, because of restrictive covenants, because of like the political racism that was happening, they were pretty much forced into this fine line along the South Side. And I believe that, you know, although it was, you know, one of the, like, what is this, hundreds and hundreds of years ago, not hundreds and hundreds, but at least 100, the demographic nature of the South Side has not changed. It's still predominantly Black, and these histories still stand. I really would encourage everyone to dive into Lifting as They Climbed. Dive into these women's histories. We provide tons of resources, especially in what we cite throughout the text, where we get our information. There's books to read. There's so much more to learn about these women than the 1 or 2 pages that we're able to include. I think just to answer a couple of questions that are about the process. So Miriam has been doing research on Black women's histories for quite a few years. She's originally from New York and came to Chicago, I believe in 1995. She thought of the project doing the Black Inside exhibit, and just thought about like, how do we map Black women's histories, you know, throughout the city. She came to me in a small group of women at the University of Illinois at Chicago, at UIC, and she said, I have this project, some research done, and I'm just, trying to get feedback. I want to see what you guys like want to contribute. It's also heavy, and I don't know whether I can complete it. And when she pulled up the first few of the women, from Emma Atkinson to Mary Richardson Jones, the earlier abolitionists that I discussed, I was just like, I have to do this, absolutely 100%. And I was one of the only women who's, stuck through the whole process and really followed up with her. So her and I, and this was in October where the original meeting happened of 2017, her and I really sat down November, December, January, February, and completely put all of our resources, energy, and thoughts into creating this guidebook. And it really, to me, just turned out way beyond anything I could have imagined. I really wouldn't have thought that I would be standing here. I just finished, when we finished the project, I was working also full time. So I was just like trying to be done. And just to see the impact, just to see communities coming together and wanting to talk about these women, to see the national attention around Chicago in a positive light. To also meet young men and women who are going through their communities and really having a better understanding of what's around them, and a more sense of pride about the streets that they're walking up and down. This has just been such a beautiful and dynamic time of my life. I want to say thank you guys so much. I know that you probably will also ask, what about the West Side? Because that question has come up so many times. We are definitely interested in expanding. I mentioned that we want to definitely include more women. We're building a digital hub for the book. We already started on a virtual map. So we are thinking about it. We also did this project, self-published it, came out of our own pockets. There was no funding. We had some volunteers to help support and take pictures and help us do some of the archival digging. And so it was just a labor of love. So in thinking about doing an expanded project and thinking about moving forward, we really would hope that people are so interested that we get additional resources to make it as amazing and as incredible as these histories are. So I think I'm gonna end there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Essence. I really enjoyed it. So we're going to take a few questions. If you would just wait for the microphone to arrive before you speak, and then it'll be able to be part of the recording. Right here.
There may be a Chicago public school teacher here who knows this better than I, but I believe that Chicago history is taught in the 3rd grade or at some point in Chicago public schools. And I wonder if you've approached the Chicago Public Schools of having this book be part of the curriculum.
Oh, thank you. So July, it's the end of July, we'll be having a teacher's workshop. We're gonna take some teachers on the tour and also do like a curriculum workshop where we talk about how they can use the project in their classrooms and how we can really infuse these Black women's histories into their syllabuses throughout the year. Yeah, so what you saw in the beginning of the video was people taking the tour. After we launched the project in March 17th, the day after we did a tour that was about 4 or 5 hours where we took community members out to some of these sites. I'm doing quite a few of those for organizations throughout the city, so youth groups, University of Chicago, some of their organizations and departments want to take some tours. So this summer is pretty packed, but I definitely want to make sure to do 2 other public tours and also a bike tour where we kind of go to some of these locations and talk about these women. So, thank you.
As an example, how did Ada McKinley get her funding?
Oh, She definitely reached out to community organizers, political pundits. She reached out to community members as a whole to keep the services going. So, and it was widely supported.
Got one right here.
Hi, I want to applaud you for doing this research. The hiding the I'm sorry, I'm nervous. The suppression of African American history in this country is so powerful. And as you said before, the suppression of African American women's history is even more powerful, that they just wipe out the history. So there's all kinds of wonderful people who are doing this work and discovering even more wonderful people like the women in your book. And I looked through it, and because I've taken the tour with the little Chicago landmarked brochure, I recognize a lot of these people, but you've told me more about some of them. And I just really encourage you to go into the communities rather than working with the University of Chicago, which is one of the biggest enemies of the African American community on the Southeast side. And they're about to move into South Shore now with this library that they support because they want a lot more power. So I'd encourage you to go into the communities, go to Ebenezer Church, go to churches along, there's churches along 48th Street. Teach people to give the kind of presentation you're giving to real people in the community, not the people the University of Chicago are going to attract, or I'm sorry, you're at the University of Illinois, they wiped out the Italian neighborhood. But I'm not concerned about that at this moment. I'm concerned about what you're doing and how powerful and important and even urgent you are, the work you're doing, because after my generation, all these ladies are, practically my age. So women your age need to know it too.
Thank you so much. You're 100% correct. I wasn't able to list all of the organizations that I'm working with, but they're definitely situated on the South Side. I think that the issue around University of Chicago is they're able to displace these communities and police these communities in a particular way because they have no understanding of those communities. So I just want to make sure that they get that same knowledge that the communities have. I understand completely, definitely. But I appreciate your comments, and it is really urgent work that I'm hoping to keep spreading throughout the city.
Your turn. Thank you so much for writing this book. I want to applaud you. It is fabulous. You're the face of this, so thank you. I want to applaud you also for getting in those schools and talking to the teachers. So please continue to do that. The elementary school kids need to know the information as well as the high school kids, so please, please do that. I also had a question for you. You did mention some of the women that really gave you a big and aha. Mm-hmm. So was there one woman out of all the women that you write about that just really knocked you off your socks?
I would say there's two. So the first one that really moved me into this is necessary work, and also just to inspire me to really think about what I'm doing on my day-to-day, how I'm using my time, and how I'm building within community. The first woman was Melissa Elam. She was a formerly enslaved woman that came to Chicago looking for work. She ends up being able to support herself, and she notices that the young women and just African-American women that were coming into the city were largely unprotected. And so she decides to create the Melissa Elam Home for Working Women and Girls. And this home provides employment support, it provides shelter, it provides programming, educational programs for young women and girls, even mothers. So when I heard about that story, it was she was formerly enslaved, and then she built an institution and sustained that institution for years and helped so many Black women. how? You know, I'm just, not how, because she did it, but also just like, how? How am I thinking about my life and what I have access to? Because I'm definitely not formally enslaved, so I can feel empowered to create changes. And when I see something that's off or wrong or oppressed communities, then I can say, what are the solutions and how can I build it? Because that's what these women were doing. I think another woman was Fannie Emanuel Hagan. She was a mother of 6. She helped her husband basically sustain a podiatry company. After that, she was much like Ada S. McKinley and much like Melissa Elam, saw that there was need for support services. So she built her own settlement house as well. She, you know, she was spearheading programming there. She was making sure that communities had access to the space. She let folks hold meetings there. So she created a community center out of her home. And then after that, she went, so she wasn't able to sustain it like financially, so she didn't receive as much support as Ada S. McKinley. But when the home ends up closing, she goes on to become, at the age of, I believe it was 42, she becomes a doctor. So she becomes a doctor and spends the rest of her life really caring for young women and girls, young Black women and girls, and is one of the only, well, not one of the only, but one of the very few African-American women doctors during the time. So these were, they were just pushing me. They were pushing me. They're like, okay, you have to think creatively about solutions. You have to really use your time, and also don't be scared of just like growth and maturity and age. You know, she was 42, she said, I'm gonna become a doctor now, you know? So we can live so many lifetimes in our lifetime, and I really appreciated that lesson from these women.
Thank you for sharing that.
I have one question about the name Lifting as They Climbed. I want to know what other names you all considered and how you selected this one, because I think that's going to tell a lot about the whole thing, the names that were considered and the one that you selected.
I'm going to be very honest and say I cannot remember. We chose the book title after, this was like, both Miriam and I were, I mean, I was sleeping at my desk to finish this book by the time of the launch, because we picked the launch date before we were done. And so I remember her sending some names, so which really probably were like mapping the history of Black women on the South Side. But Lifting as They Climbed specifically had a resonance to me because that is exactly what they did. That is exactly what they did. They saw these conditions in their community, and they also had their own personal aspirations, and they lifted their own community members, their families, people they didn't know, people who, it was really, especially when I saw the streamline from the Great Migration that went through the Civil Rights Movement or even the Chicago Arts Renaissance, it was really this tone of, these are my people. And if your people are really struggling in any particular way, then you take it upon yourself to make sure that they have what they need to survive. These are basic necessities that they were providing for. So they completely lifted as they climbed, and it couldn't have, you know how you just hear something, you're like, that's it right there. That was the moment. That was the moment. Thank you.
I'm glad that you mentioned the Wall of Fame at Wendell Phillips High School. I didn't know anything about it, but I knew Wendell Phillips High School. And I went, there was a tour after the Printers Row. They have a festival every year. And they had this tour. And the guide brought us to Wendell Phillips, and he showed this Wall of Fame. And I was really blown away by these people that were presented on this wall. So I'm glad that you mentioned that.
Thank you. Yeah, I had no idea either. And so I was literally on a tour speaking about the book. Not a tour, we was just doing an interview. And we walked up to Wendell Phillips, and they led us inside of the building. And I was just amazed. You know, you could probably sneak in you know, only if you have good intentions, because it's right at the top. It's right in the first corridor that you walk into the school. So, I mean, it's a beautiful sight to see, just the legacies, and also how schools have influenced those legacies that Chicago has. So.
Hello.
Hi.
You mentioned that you've worked with several or many organizations to get this book together, and it seems that these women have built their networks. There's a network that you have built with this book, and I feel that a lot of us here have an activist spirit and would like to know how to support your work and possibly find ways to connect with the community and to, you know, give our time, give our resources.
Well, thank you so much. You can, if you go to our site, the book site where you could purchase the book, there's a link for you to contact us. So if you know of any women that were missing in the text, that's important to us. We know we couldn't think of everyone. We know in our research time frame that it was difficult to sort and to narrow it down. We want people to be able to know that we're like open and this is a collaborative project, so that they can come or email us and let us know that, hey, there are so many more women that you guys should include in the next one. I think on the ground, as far as like being engaged in your community, I would love for folks to just take the book and take the tour. Take whoever would be interested. I think take young people, take your parents, take your children. If you're a part of an organization, just mention that this tour exists and that these histories exist, and that you could just really become a part of this project by sharing it with others. Hashtag us, Lift Climb, because we'd love to see and share the stories. But to me, it's the real work of this project, from the heart of it, is about how many more people can learn about these women, how many more people will understand who Alice Browning is, or who Ada S. McKinley, and who these 48 women really were. Their stories are just so rich. So I would just love for a share out, you know, if you are on social media and you don't really feel like getting outside in the tour because the weather is kind of crazy right now, just share the book, take a picture of it, or just share the website. We just want this to go as far as possible, because to me, the work is just around how do we uplift their legacies? How do we make sure that the erasure of African American women's contributions don't continue, especially in this digital age when we have so many ways to preserve our narratives. So
I just had one question. These women were obviously, each in their own way, a deep source of strength for their community and people around them. Did you find any common thread of where they refreshed themselves, their own strength? Did they, through their church, through their spouse, through family, where did they pull from?
I love that, self-care. So it depended on what era they were in, what time they were living in. Earlier on, the abolitionist women, I mentioned Emma Atkinson in the beginning, she was heavily involved in the church. Quinn Chapel is a church that we include in the guidebook. A gorgeous, gorgeous, gorgeous church. I mean, they let us inside and it's just incredible. But you can feel the spiritual energy in that space. They were heavily involved in churches. I think it really depended on which woman. A lot of them were artists. They were creatives, dancers. So I think that these creative outlets gave them the opportunity to just kind of, you know, let go or just be themselves and do exactly what it was that they felt called to do. So it wasn't, their lives weren't just the heavy lifting. It was also the creativity, the innovation, and also the relationships that they built. A lot of these women were actually, I see so many times they're friends. They worked with each other. So I think that is, especially speaking as a Black woman today, the relationships are a part of our self-care and how we, you know, refuel ourselves. And you could just connect those dots throughout the guidebook. And once you dig a little bit more into the histories, you can see that it was a community effort, so.
Right, thank you.